I think that we are all in a grip of a very strong picture that the world of tomorrow will change our notions of morality so dramatically that it will be a very different world, and our Stone Age morality will become irrelevant. Technology transfers the world in the speed of light. Religion, the main religion now on the ascent, namely Islam, crosses all borders, and the notion of the Ummah as a global religion is very much now in the air. And the economy, of course, will make borders among nations something of the past. Now, I would like to make a cautious reminder that borders are important, and we are not in a cosmopolitan world and not about to be in a cosmopolitan world, but we are still in international world, where nation states are still delineated and are within borders and boundaries. And one element that I would like to talk is about borders and walls. Between 1945 and 1999, there were only 22 international wars. But there were over 120 intra-national wars, namely domestic wars, civil wars. There are far more civil wars now than ever, and less international wars. International wars, namely wars that cross boundaries, state boundaries, take the mean duration of such wars is 3 months, and the number of people killed between 45 and 1999 is 3.5 million people. In civil wars, 60 million were killed, and the duration of those wars, the mean duration is 6 years. So when we think globally, and we think that borders are obsolete, actually within the borders, a great deal of action and instability takes place. And those domestic wars, insurgeries in many cases, take place where they can take place. In rugged environment, when there is a supply of weapons, when there is an accessibility of money by selling drugs or diamonds. And some of them are motivated by ideology, not all of them, not even most of them. Wars take place where they can take place, almost irrespective of ethnic diversity, of religious rifts or ideological rifts. Those enhance sometimes, they make bitter the wars, but we are in a situation of wars, domestic wars, and we always mention in domestic wars international interference and people from the outside, Al-Qaeda or whatever, but most of the wars are very local. And while we now try to think globally, the situation should also force us to think locally. There was a city planner who advised Mayor Dizengoff, the mayor of Tel Aviv, Patrick Geddes, his name, and he coined the slogan, "Think globally, act locally." And I think that this is still a very valid slogan. So while we try to think in futuristic morality terms and about all sorts of thought experiments about the future in which we'll have one planet governed by one body, we are still in an international situation, in a situation of more and more local wars, and that seems to be the trend in the near future. So I'll end by again reminding the slogan of Geddes, namely, think globally but act locally. Thank you.
So, Professor Moisy, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was going to pick the second question you raised and look, as a specialist of international relations, at the economic dimension. You spoke about international relations, so I may move out of my field. What is the link between globalization and ethics? And if you connect three recent events, the Arab Revolution, the world financial and economic crisis, and within that, the crisis of the euro and Europe, I think there is a continuity between those three events, which does not appear immediately, which I would summarize under a famous formula which I plagiarize: it's the ethics, stupid. The Arab Revolution. Well, of course, it's about politics. But by the end of the day, in countries like Tunisia or Egypt, what society could not accept was the corruption of despotic regime. One can say that despotism was more acceptable than corruption. It is said that on the day he had to leave his country for Saudi Arabia, the president of Tunisia asked his closest advisor, "What can I do now?" And he said, "It's maybe too late, Mr. President, but you have to divorce from your wife and your wife's family, and it may be the last resort." If you move to the financial crisis, which starts in the United States with the subprime crisis, well, it's about the infectious greed. To quote the words of Alan Greenspan, who himself was guilty of not controlling the greed of his many actors around him. But by the end of the day, it's also about ethics in the following sense. An industry, the financial industry, has launched product without testing them, just for reasons of greed, just because they were fascinated by the idea that the sky was the limit and that nothing should stop them from having a two figures growth. And of course, it collapsed. No car industry, no pharmaceutical industry would have launched a product without testing them. the financial industry did that. In Europe, it's above all a political crisis, because the euro is a political project. But it is a political crisis that has a huge ethical dimension. And the issue of fairness, again, is absolutely central. You see policies that are advocating liberalism, take risks. This is the flexibility of our system. It's fine, except the CEO do not take risks. The risk of their employees is to get fired. And unemployment has never been that high. But at the top of the societies, the CEO are in fact protecting themselves with golden parachutes. All of that is within the context of globalization, which is characterized by one key word: transparency. We live in a world where, for the first time, not only the very rich know or the very poor are living, but not the very poor know exactly what the very rich are doing, or they live. That's the transparency society. We've lost the privilege of ignorance. This is a problem for states who have to decide whether to intervene or not to intervene when there is an ethnic cleansing that is taking place. But we've lost also the privilege of ignorance in that particular dimension. That's why I think it's the ethics stupid. If I may conclude, I would say that what is important in my mind is that societies that are dominated by the rule of law are ultimately less vulnerable than societies where corruption reigns supreme. Therefore, a paradox. The virus which we are witnessing is a Western one. There was growth in the East and depth in the West. But the emerging countries are much more vulnerable than the classical societies because they do not have those antibodies that are constituted by democracy and the rule of law. So this is the ethics stupid, the importance of fairness, which has never been more central. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and I see that we are dealing with a variety of issues that pointing to different directions, and we're going to have to relate them to one another as well. Yuval, please, the floor is yours.
Is it working? Yes. Okay. I would like to relate to the first question about technology and ethics, and actually not to answer the question, or not to try to answer the question, but to put some more flesh on the question, put on not only flesh, but also a flashlight on it, and highlight what's so important about it. We might be one of the last generations of Homo sapiens. In the medium future, between a few decades and a few centuries at most, Homo sapiens will most likely disappear. Not that it will annihilate itself in some nuclear or environmental catastrophe. It can happen, but it's not very likely at present. What is much more likely is that Homo sapiens will upgrade itself to a completely different kind of being. Now, there have been many revolutions in history, political, social, cultural, economic, technological, but through all these revolutions, one thing always remained constant, which is the human mind. The human mind has been the constant base on which all societies, all identities, all beliefs and ethical judgments have always been founded. Our world today is very different from, say, ancient Jerusalem, biblical Jerusalem, in many different respects. Again, political, economic, technological, and so forth. But people 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem had basically the same cognitive, the same emotional, and the same spiritual abilities that we have. They experienced the world and themselves basically in the same way that we experience it. And this is why we still have interest in the Bible or in the philosophy of Plato or in the works of Confucius, because the mind is constant. Now, this is about to change. The next revolution in history will, of course, transform the economy, society, politics, and so forth, but above all, it will transform the mind and replace Homo sapiens with a different kind of being. When we think about the future, let's say in science fiction, we usually think about a world in which people like us, like you and me, enjoy better technology. Maybe they'll have light-speed spaceships, maybe they'll have laser guns, intelligent robots, and so forth, but they'll be like us. And this is the basic misconception. The truly revolutionary potential of technology is to change the people or the beings traveling in the spaceships, not the tools or the weapons or the communication technology. How will the mind be transformed? At present, there are three main ways which we can see before us to do it. First is biological engineering, to re-engineer our bodies and our brains using either psychiatric drugs or genetic engineering or a combination of them. The second way is by cyborg engineering, which means to create a direct interface between brains and computers. And the third way is to engineer completely non-organic minds. When the mind will be transformed, the way that one feels, thinks, and experiences reality will also be transformed beyond recognition. And in the medium future, say in 50 years or 100 years and 200 years, we will be inherited by beings who are more different from us than we are different, for example, from the Neanderthals that came before us. And just as Neanderthals cannot possibly understand our world, our identities, and our ethics, so we are in no position to understand the world, the identity, and the moral dilemmas and ethics of these future beings. This will likely cause the collapse of our entire world of meaning. In 100 years or so, I don't think that identities such as Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Muslims, or men and women will have any meaning. There won't be any Israelis, there won't be any Jews, and there won't be any women, because the substratum for the existence of these identities will be different. So in the long term, all the heated ethical debates about things like the Arab-Israeli conflict, or about the clash of civilization, or about gender inequality, will simply become meaningless. There is only one ethical question that in this long-term or medium-term view has importance, and this is the question, what kind of minds do we want to engineer? Thank you.
Well, thanks. This is it's a very interesting and important comment. I'm sure there will be a discussion among us about this bold hypothesis, and I want to ask Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would talk a bit about the last question and the emergence of religion and what it means for the future. I would like to bring it back to Professor Moisey's wonderful comments when he finished his comment with a concept or suggestion for fairness and the rule of law. And every time when I think about morality, justice, or questions like that, I'm thinking of a theory of justice by the American philosopher John Rawls, who once said that justice is the first virtue of social institutions. And I think that this notion is as valid as it was in the 1970s when he put it forward, and will be for some while, in fact, because what he's talking about is the morality of human conduct and the principle of justice, and these are universal. I'm sure everybody read John Rawls, so I don't really need to repeat his major premise, but one of it is the idea of the original position, which is when people are born, they don't know, hypothetically, they don't know their place in society, and therefore it allows to create just a world, because there is no set hierarchies, and it is much more valuable in a sense of meritocracy. And in this way, people with the competing visions of justice can actually agree on morals of a pluralistic society. That actually brings me to the religion question, which I find very dangerous for the future. And not as because you can judge by my last name, I'm a former Soviet, and therefore a former atheist, but actually is because religion could be problematic, because the morals vary for religion, from groups within religion and whatnot. Absolute obedience to authority can also be problematic, because they suggest that God created morality, but each God then created different morality. And for a person to be morally responsible, you really have to have some sort of individual decision of how to act and behave in general context. Only guarded by the legal institutions' free will here is very relevant. There are problems of threat of eternal punishment or eternal rewards, this kind of carrot and sticks theory that God provides us with, which is also could be problematic for current life, because if you are to be moral, you really shouldn't be that thinking that you're only moral because then you will be rewarded or punished in the future. Another thing that I think is worth considering here is that most religions came from the traditional and ancient belief system when slavery, and I think it goes back to Professor Margalit, when slave system and all other systems that genital mutilation, that we're no longer think irrelevant, and so twisting all this rigid systems with the ad hoc rationalizations to fit a more modern society could be very, very problematic, and in fact already is very problematic. There are some other things that we can talk about. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Absolutism, I think one of the problems with the set of religion which becomes political, because there are contexts and consequences that absolutism may not take into consideration, but the world is really not absolute, and the globaler we become, with borders or without, absolutism is really of no help. So I think the only way religion can help us is an individual freewheeling moral code that each of us follow. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and whatnot. This is all very helpful. But when it is an institutionalized belief system of a group or a state, then it can be deeply misinterpreted and abused. I mean, we all followed in the last 10 years this horrible scandal came out of the Vatican, and really moral bankruptcy of the Catholic faith that followed that. Forgive such frivolous example, but I think it's important. The Godfather, 1970, something that captured the world imagination with a mafia depiction. We all loved it for various reasons. But one of the reasons I think it really was such an important event is because it was a really tremendous rupture between the Catholic belief system, the claims that the mafia characters put forward for their group, and their personal conduct, that is, they steal and kill. Clearly, another example that I have, and it is always my example, is Russia, which clearly very dear to me, more dear than Hollywood or Italy. And there, once again, I mean, it has been a very religious society. and in many ways it prevented it from certain types of development because it was clinging to Orthodox Christian Byzantine formula for existence and remained an absolute monarchy when the rest of the world, the rest of Europe, because Russia was really at the time part of the European monarchical system, other European powers already had constitutions. Yesterday, Tony Blair very eloquently talked about the necessity of an evolutionary process. And since Russians were denied that evolutionary process in 1917, there was a brutal revolution, Bolshevik revolution of 1917. As I said, you know, former Soviet and former atheist, I can tell you that one of the indictment of communism should not be that it was based on rational dialectic materialism or it was atheist, but the problem is that that it really succumbed to the Russian tradition of despotism, mysticism, obscurantism. I mean, it just really created the same formula. The Tsar as a God messenger on earth and his subjects the serfs, although there was a different iconography that was created. I don't know if you may remember, there was Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and whatnot. But it was the same type of religion, which was called communism. In fact, Stalin's collectivization, by the way, very religious man, it was based on a psychological tradition of serfdom and obedience. So in somewhat conclusion, I want to bring it back to the contemporary Russia when Vladimir Putin's state, as you know, he was recently re-elected. He's a very religious man too. He wears religion on his sleeve at all times, but it doesn't make matters better in any way, as it didn't help Michael Corleone, or then Tony Soprano, another great mafia example, very religious as well. For example, recent scandal in Russia was that a rock group, Pussy Riots, they sang anti-Putin songs and slogans on the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, and it was not against Christ in any way. It was not anti-religious. It was anti-Putin, and the last time I checked, he's no God. And yet, these people were, these three young women were arrested, and they were charged with insulting the faithful. I mean, it's a direct quote. Faithful were not insulted, but their faith was manipulated for state purposes. Henry Kissinger yesterday said that a good leader is to take his or her country from where it was to where it has never been. I think religion can help. I don't think it can do a new trick and reborn the world in you. In fact, bringing it back to John Rawls, he was talking about the leader is a good person whom he defines as one who has the qualities of moral character that would be rational for members of a well-ordered society to want in their associates. And I don't think that Vladimir Putin or Michael Corleone or Tony Soprano, for that matter, actually can lead us into the future, or their examples can lead us into the future. Thank you.